Ajnanamagyanaatimirandasya Jnananjanashalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanyam Bhishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamahyam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Utapadakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagarna Raghunathanvitam Tam Sajivam Sandvaitam Savadhutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagarna Lalita Shri Vishakhanvitamscha Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Presthaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakti Vedanta Swaminiti Namine Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarine Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna. Please forgive me again for my lateness. Okay, Jai, good. So I'll be speaking now, I guess the last several classes, at least the last 7 classes, have been summarizing the different chapters of Bhagavad Gita. So the chapter that we are on now is Chapter 8. Which in Sanskrit is known as Taraka Brahma Yoga, and Srila Prabhupada translates that as attaining the supreme. Srila Prabhupada's English title of the chapter. And we'll see why. So Chapter 8 actually begins at the end of Chapter 7. There's this verse 30 of Chapter 7 says, Sadhi bhutadi devam mam sadhi yaknyam chayevidu prayana kale pichamam te vidur yukta chetasaha. Srila Prabhupada's translation, those in full consciousness of me, who know me, the Supreme Lord, to be the governing principle of the material manifestation, of the demigods, of all methods of sacrifice, can understand and know me, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, even at the time of death. So particularly this last point, knowing the Supreme Personality of Godhead even at the time of death, is the main subject of the 8th chapter. So the 8th chapter then begins with Arjuna's questioning Krishna, asking him, these things that you mentioned to me just now, Adibhuta, Adiyagnyam, Adidhaivam, all these different things, he asks Krishna to define those terms. Of course, in Srila Prabhupada's translation, we have the translation and a little bit of explanation, but to Arjuna, Krishna just kind of said these terms. So he wants him to define them. So he says, Kim tad brahma, kim adhyatmam, kim karma purushottama, adibhutam cha kim proktam, adhidaivam kim uchyate. He says, this is Srila Prabhupada's translation, Arjuna inquired, O my Lord, O Supreme Person, what is Brahman? What is the self? What are fruitive activities? What is this material manifestation? What are the demigods? Please explain this to me. So he asks about these things. He asks about Brahma, Adhyatmam, Karma, Adibhutam, Adidaivam. And then in the next verse, he asks about Adiyagnya and Prayana kale chakatam gyeyosi niyatatmabi. And then he says, then he asks about adiyagya, and he asks about how to remember adiyagya, which is translated as Srila Prabhupada's translation as the Lord of Sacrifice. How to remember the Lord of Sacrifice at the time of death. So these things Arjuna asks about in the first 2 verses. Krishna answers him, and he basically describes that Brahma, in this case, refers to the jiva, to the soul. Brahma, of course, also refers to the Supreme Lord. But in this case, Krishna used it to refer to the jivas, which is not contradictory because Brahma just means spirit in a general sense, and the jivas are spirit. Then he says, so that's Brahma. Then he asks, Arjuna asks about Adhyatma. Adhyatma, then Krishna says that the eternal nature of that jiva, the svabhav of that jiva, that is Adhyatma. And I'll just go over these briefly because mostly these things aren't so important to the gist of or to the essence of this chapter. And then he asks about adibhutam, then he asks about karma. Karma, then Krishna defines, we all know what karma means. It's the actions and their subsequent reactions of the activities of those living entities, which Krishna described. And then adibhutam. And Krishna uses this word here to define adibhutam. Let's see here. Yes, in the next verse. Adibhutam ksharo bhava. Ksharo. Krishna sometimes uses him as akshara. Akshara means he doesn't change. He stays the same. But in this case, Krishna's just using kshara, ksharaha. Ksharaha means always changing. So adibhutam, this material world, the material energy. So Krishna has described the soul, he's described the Supreme Soul, and now he's describing the material energy, which he defines as ksharaha, always constantly changing. And then the last few things Arjuna asks about adibhutam, adidaivam. Adidaivam, Krishna defines as purushaha. Purushaha, which we'll hear about in the 11th chapter when we get there. Krishna's Vishvarup, Krishna's universal form, which also contains all of the devatas. So that Krishna defines as, that's Krishna's definition of Adidevam. And then Adhiyagyam. So now we're getting to the most essential, at least for this chapter. Adhiyagyam, Krishna defines, Adhiyagno hamevatra. He says, who's Adhiyagyam? He says, aham. Which means I. And then not only does he say I, but he says eva. He says aham evatra dehe deha bratambaraha. So he says, I am certainly that adhiyagya, who am situated atra dehe, within the body. And then he refers to Arjuna as deha bratambara, the best of all of the embodied living beings. Those who are in bodies, Arjuna is the best. That's what Krishna's saying here. So adhiyagya is Krishna. And then the last thing that Arjuna asks about is how to remember that adhiyagya at the time of death, which Krishna refers to at the end of the 7th chapter. And then Krishna says, that's the explanation of prayana, or what is it? The explanation of the remembrance of Krishna at the time of death is explained throughout this chapter. That's really what Krishna is expanding on here. That's what Krishna sees as the most essential thing. So then he says, I am that adhiyagya, I am that paramatma, that soul, or that super soul, seated next to the atma within the body. And then he says, a very famous verse, Antakale chamameva smaranupva kalevaram yav prayati samadbhavam yati nastyatra samshaya. And he says, whoever at the end of this life quits this body remembering me and nothing else, then he at once attains my nature. And then he says, yati nastyatra samshaya. In this there is no doubt whatsoever. So that Krishna says. And that's the setup for this chapter. Then Krishna gives the general principle in the next verse, another very famous verse. Yam yam vapi smaram bhavam tyajatyante kalevaram tam tame vaiti kaunteya sadatad bhava bhavataha. He says whatever one remembers, in fact, not just if you remember me, but whatever you remember at the time of death, that you attain. So, and then he says, but don't just remember whatever. Don't just remember anything. Then he specifically says, Tasmat sarveshu kaleshu mamanusmara yudhyacha mayarpata manobuddhir mame vaishyasya samshaya. He says, therefore, you should always think of me. Now, why is that? Krishna doesn't just say, think of me at the time of death. Krishna says, always think of me. Now, why is that? Krishna basically is saying that the reason that you attain whatever you remember at the time of death is because, generally speaking, at the time of death, you remember that thing which you've spent your life cultivating. You remember whatever comes to mind basically is just the fruit or the product of the momentum that you've built up throughout your life. And that's really, and then Krishna at the time of death, then, not, or I guess I should say karma at the time of death, Krishna's agent, then fulfills that desire. Whatever momentum one develops throughout their life, then one gets a suitable body to enact those desires or to continue to fulfill those desires. So, but Krishna says, therefore, always think of me. And Krishna will outline in this chapter why. Why should one think of Krishna at the time of death? Why not remember anything else? Because if one doesn't remember Krishna at the time of death, if one just remembers any old thing at the time of death, then there's no guarantee. Krishna is speaking to Arjuna because he's speaking like this to Arjuna because Arjuna is desirous of being liberated from the material energy. Arjuna is desirous of achieving some spiritual, and Arjuna is desirous of leaving behind the suffering that comes with being within this material world. Arjuna is in a situation which is extremely difficult. He's tasked with killing some of his closest relatives, his teacher, Dronacharya. He's face to face with them on a battlefield. Now, Arjuna is the greatest warrior in the world. Arjuna's not just some schmuck who ended up on the battlefield. Arjuna is the greatest of warriors. But this task proved to him so difficult that he dropped his bow. He said, Krishna, I won't fight. I'm not going to do this. I can't do this. But Krishna says that, Krishna told him, the first instruction actually Krishna gives to Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita is a chastisement. He's saying, you're speaking, he says, Prajnavadam Shrabhashase. He says, you're speaking such learned words, you're acting like a big Panditji. But actually you're a fool. Gatasana gatasam sha nanu shochanti panditaha. He says, if you really want to be a Pandit, then stop lamenting for these things that Panditas don't lament about. Namely, the body which is going to perish anyway, and the various relationships that one has with other bodies, which will also perish in time. So Krishna is saying, there's something higher. There's a higher purpose here that you should understand. And so Krishna spends the entire Bhagavad Gita telling him about that higher purpose, which is to execute the order of the Supreme Lord. To engage in activities which are favorable for the pleasure of the Supreme Lord. If one desires the welfare of himself, if one desires the welfare of his relatives, if one desires the welfare of the entire world, it hinges on the pleasure of the Supreme Lord. There's a... well, anyway, yeah. So... Arjuna doesn't want to fight because he has this interest in the welfare of his family. He has this interest in the welfare of the world at large. And in the beginning of the Bhagavad Gita, he gave many arguments, even from the perspective of dharma, of good conduct, of religion even. He gave all these arguments. He said, what's going to happen to the wives of all these men who will be killed? What's going to happen to their children? What's going to happen to the state of affairs in the world, and what to speak of even just all these men dying needlessly, suffering and dying needlessly, fighting needlessly. What's the use of it all? So Arjuna gave many arguments, even from one perspective, from a worldly perspective, are good arguments. Arjuna is a very saintly person, but Krishna then gave him the better perspective. Actually, not just the better perspective, but the real perspective. Basically, he said, if you really want to help these people, if you really desire the welfare of the world, then you have to act on my behalf. You have to act according to my order. Because if Krishna is pleased, If Krishna is pleased, then the entire world automatically becomes pleased. Krishna has a plan. Krishna has desires. Krishna has things which he's trying to do. Specifically through the battle of Kurukshetra, Krishna was trying to establish Maharaj Yudhishthir, the emblem of Dharma, the paragon of Dharma, of good conduct, of religion, as the emperor of the world, which would allow so many people to be helped, so many people to be delivered, even from a worldly perspective. And Krishna also said that Krishna brings up the perspective that I'm the Supreme Lord, I'm standing here on the battlefield, and I'm telling you to do this. He says, you think that by engaging in my or executing my order, anything bad can happen? He says that anybody who's engaged in good work never meets a bad end. So Krishna, he's giving Arjuna this instruction, and Arjuna can't understand it because he has this worldly perspective, this perspective that I am this body and that everything in relation to this body is mine. Of course, Arjuna is eternally, he's a perfect soul, but he was covered by Maya just so actually Krishna could speak to us. So now Krishna is explaining to him the ultimate goal of life. Krishna is explaining to him that ultimate goal which puts everything else in perspective. Because Arjuna, he was speaking from the platform of somebody whose understanding is that the ultimate goal of life is to be happy in this world. And the ultimate goal of life is to have a comfortable, nice situation in this world. But Arjuna is saying that, but Krishna is saying that that's not the case. The goal of life is not to be happy. The goal of life is to engage in the service of Krishna and at the time of death be reinstated in our constitutional position as his servants eternally. Because that's our nature. That's what Krishna refers to as adhyatmam, the eternal nature of the soul, is that it is intrinsically a servant of Krishna, eternally a servant of Krishna. But having come to this world, having forgotten that intrinsic nature, Krishna is now speaking to us and enlightening us how we can re-enter that nature, how we can be re-established in that position. And Krishna is saying that the way to do that is to spend one's life constantly remembering him in such a way that by the time of death, one is so absorbed in him that one has no other thing in mind. That just at the time of death, they remember Krishna and we can go back to him. So then Krishna is saying here, to tasmat sarveshu kaleshu mamanusmara yudhyaja. He's specifically telling Arjuna, he's saying, fight, but remember me while you're fighting. So Krishna is now giving the method, how can we always remember him? Then Krishna expands on that. He says, Abhyasa yoga yuktena chetasa nanya gamina paramam purusham divyam yati parthanu chintayan. He says, he who meditates on me, on this, as the Supreme Lord, whose mind is constantly engaged in remembering me, undeviated. Not that sometimes I remember Krishna and other times but constantly remembering Krishna. Constantly remembering Krishna, and Krishna is telling Arjuna, he says, fight, but remember me while you're fighting. And he's not just saying, remember me, like just think of me and do whatever you want, but remember me in the sense of remember that I'm telling you to do this. Remember that this is the right thing to do, that this is service to me. So Krishna's not just saying, remember me and do whatever damn thing you like, but he's saying, remember me, and by remembering me, do the right thing. So then he expands how exactly to meditate on Krishna. He says, Kavim Puranam Shasitaram Arnoraniyam Anusmaret Arnoraniyam Samanusmaret Yaha Sarvasya Dhataram Achintya Rupam Aditya Varnam Tamasaf Parastat. Anybody who knows Purusha Sukta knows that last line. Aditya Varnam Tamasaf Parastat. So he says, how should one remember Krishna? One should remember Krishna as Kavim, the one who knows everything, as Puranam, the oldest, Anushasitaram, the controller, Arno Arniyamsam, as smaller than the smallest atom, the most finest, most refined thing. And then he says, Anusmaredyaha, he says, one who remembers me like this, Sarvasya Dhataram, the maintainer of everything. Achintya, inconceivable. Achintya Rupam, whose form is inconceivable. Aditya Varnam, luminous like the sun, Tamasaf Parastat, and transcendental to darkness. So these are different ways that one can think of Krishna. Different aspects of Krishna that one can meditate on. And then he says, Prayena kale manasachalena bhaktya yukto yoga balena chaiva bhruvor madhye pranamavesha samyak satam param purusham upeti devyam. And now with this 10th verse, now Krishna starts explaining a process which the acharyas who comment on Bhagavad Gita refer to as Shat Chakra Yoga. So Shat Chakra Yoga means yoga which is meditating on the 6 chakras within the body, the 6 energy points within the body. And so Krishna explains this. Krishna calls it Abhyasa Yoga. Means like regulated yoga. Abhyasa means like, practice, or if anybody, usually like in Indian languages, at least in like North Indian languages, like usually like habit. Abhyasa. So these are regulations by which one can remember Krishna. So he speaks like this. He says that first he gives the first he gives these different ways that one can remember him, and then he gives this process by which one who at the time of death can fix his life airs right between the eyebrows and engage himself in remembering Krishna. And so then he gives in the next verse, who's qualified for such things. He says persons who are very learned in the Vedas, who utter Omkara, who are great sages, who are very renounced, Vitaragaha, who are free from attachment and aversion, and one who is, and then he says celibate, he says who practices brahmacharya. And so now he starts explaining the process. He says one should be completely detached from all sensual engagements. He says close the door of all the senses. Then he says, being situated in this, then vibrate the syllable Om. And by doing that, one can remember Krishna at the time of death, be reinstated in his position. So then Krishna gives this verse. And by this verse, he explains, and this is expanded on in the commentaries of not just Srila Prabhupada, but our different acharyas. In this verse, then Krishna, which is another very famous verse, the next 2 verses are very famous. Actually, the next 3 verses are very famous. Then he says, Ananya Chaita Satatam Yomam Smariti Nityashaha Tasyaham Sulabhav Partha Nitya Yuktasya Yoganaha. Then he says, but one who constantly remembers me without deviation. He says, by such a person, Tasyaham Sulabhav Partha, I'm very easily attained by that. And he says, Nitya Yuktasya Yoganaha, because they're constantly engaged in yoga. So then he says, then he explains the results of being, of attaining him. And then he says, Mamupeti punarjanma dukkhalayam ashashvatam. Very famous line. Napnuvanti mahatmana samsiddhim paramam gataha. After attaining me, those great souls who have left this world, which is dukkhalayam, which is a place of misery, they never come back. Mamupeti punarjanma dukkhalayam ashashvatam napnuvanti mahatmana samsiddhim paramam gataha. Because by their perfection, they've reached the supreme goal. And now he gives the fate of others. What if somebody doesn't attain him? He says, Brahma bhuvanaloka punaravartino Arjuna mamupetya tu kaunteya punarjanma navidyate. He says, and then he describes the nature of this world, that from Lord Brahma's abode, from the topmost material planet to the lowest, he says all are places of punarjanma, of repeated birth. He says, Mamupeti tu kauntaya. He says, but one who attains me, he says, punarjanma na vidyate. They don't know rebirth. So Krishna, he describes this process of Shat Chakra Yoga. But then with this verse, Ananya Cheta Satadam Yo Mam Smariti Nityashaha, he actually kind of goes back on his word, on what he said previously. He describes this Yoga Mishra Bhakti. This Bhakti, but it's mixed a little bit with Yoga. But then he just says, but anyway, for one who just always remembered me somehow or other by hook or by crook, in pure devotion, not as just the Paramatma, not as just the master of the yogis or something like that, but one who remembers me in love, by his constant engagement in that devotional remembrance, that he'll attain me. And then, so then Krishna, he goes through the nature of this world and how it's always being manifest and unmanifest. And then he describes, so here's where he confirms this, what I just said. Then he describes, although the world is coming and going, it's being created and annihilated again and again, and the souls are coming and going also in different ways. And then he describes these two ways of dying. One who passes away in the light, and then one who passes away in darkness. So he says first, then he describes somebody who passes away according to or in light, and he describes the one who passes away during Uttarayana, when the sun is moving north, in the Shukla Paksha, or as we in our Sampradaya we like to say Gaura Paksha, because Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. But anyway, that's another thing. So who passes away during the waxing moon, Shukla Paksha, the bright fortnight, and while the sun is moving north, then by the strength of this astrological arrangement, it describes that one can, there's a verse specifically, it's in the Chandogya Upanishad, which describes that by way of all these different demigods, the demigods of the Uttarayana, demigods of the presiding deity, the Shukla Paksha, the presiding deity of the month and year, and all these different things, then one eventually can go to Krishna. And then he describes these people who pass away in darkness, who pass away during Krishna Paksha, the waning moon, and who pass away during Dakshinaya, when the sun is moving south. And he says that such people have to come back. So then the question arises, well, is it just, what's the meaning of this? Is it just that it's just like a lottery that it just, whenever you die, it's like you get those people who just get lucky and die during this particular astrological arrangement, they can go back to Krishna, but everybody else can't. So yeah, it seems contradictory to what Krishna is saying. That then what's the use of remembering him? Is what Krishna is a question that one could ask. So what Krishna is referring to here is those who specifically try, according to their basically what Krishna is describing is two paths. The path that one of the paths is the one he described earlier, this Shat Chakra Yoga, which is also he lumps in with like Jnana Yoga, with like impersonal impersonal realization, moksha basically. So those who engage in these processes, by the strength of that process, they'll actually be allowed to leave their body at this certain time. So it's not just a lottery, but by the strength of this process that they engage in, they'll be allowed to leave at a particular time. And then in this way they can attain some kind of moksha. But those who just engage in fruitive activities, in karma yoga, who engage in activities which produce results, engaging in different certainly pious activities, but not exactly spiritual activities. Then they leave at a certain time and they have to come back due to the nature of their activities in this life. So Krishna described all these things, these ways of remembering him, the process of Shat Chakra Yoga by which one can remember Krishna at the time of death. But then basically at the end of the chapter, he kind of throws it away. Another very famous verse. Vedeshu yagneshu tapassu chaiva daneshu yat punya phalam pradishtam atyeti tat sarvamidam viditva yogi param stanam upaiti chadyam. He says, but a person who engages in pure bhakti, not bhakti mixed with yoga, not bhakti mixed with karma, not bhakti mixed with jnana, one who engages in pure bhakti and remembers me, automatically he gets the result of studying the Vedas, doing all kinds of yajna, giving in charity, doing all kinds of pious activities, and doing yoga. Automatically he gets the result of those things. And he says, Yogi param stanam upaiti chadyam. And then he says, on the strength of this, or he says, Adyeti tat sarvam idam viditva. He's above all these things. A bhakti yogi, he's above all studies and yajna and all these things as soul means for attaining self-realization. He says, Adyeti tat sarvam idam viditva, yogi param stanam upaiti chadyam. And then, by strength of his devotion to Krishna, then he attains the supreme abode, param sthanam. So the theme of this chapter, and let's see what time it is. Okay, I'll stop in a minute. The theme of this chapter is a similar theme which is present throughout Bhagavad Gita. That Krishna describes many different processes. He describes karma yoga, he describes this Shat Chakra yoga, he describes dhyana yoga in the 6th chapter. All these different processes. And he describes even worship of devatas and things like that. But as he's describing all these different processes, there's all these verses where Krishna says, okay, I just described this, but anyway, just forget about it. He says, and then at the end, in the 18th chapter, one of the last verses of the Bhagavad Gita, then he confirms. He says, Sarva dharman prityaja. He says, all these dharmas that I've described, other than just surrendering to me, mam ekam sharanam braja. Actually, this is an order. Actually, he's telling Arjuna. He says, mam ekam sharanam braja. He says, just come to give everything else up. This word tyaga, I'm sure everybody here is familiar with the word tyaga. Tyaga means, to renounce. But not just tyaga, parityaga. He says, far away. Not even just give it up. As far away as possible. And just mam ekam sharanam braja. Just to me only. Mam ekam sharanam braja. Just take shelter of me only. That's it. That's all you have to do. And he says, ma shucha. Don't worry about anything else. You don't have to worry about, at the end of the 6th chapter where Krishna describes this elaborate yoga process, Arjuna says, how am I supposed to do that? How am I supposed to go to the Himalayas and sit on kusha grass and sit on a deer skin and control my breath and all that? He says, I'm a kshatriya, I'm a warrior. By nature I'm passionate. By nature I'm fiery. Because how is it possible for me to do that? And then at the beginning of the 7th chapter, he says, Maya sakta manaparta yogam yunjan madashraya. He says, okay, now I'll tell you real yoga. And real yoga means to be engaged specifically in remembering me, in hearing about me. He says, Maya sakta manaparta yogam yunjan madashraya asamshrayam samagramam yatha gyasasi tatshranu. He says, by practicing yoga in full consciousness of me. Actually, this is a continuation of the last verse, where he says, Yoginam api sarvesham madgatenan taratmana shraddhavan bhajate yamam samayukta tamomataha. That the best yogi, okay, I've described this yoga process. But he says, the best yogi, the real yogi, is one who with faith always worships me in his heart. And then in the 7th chapter, he says, Maya sakta manaparta yogam yunjan madashrayaha. He says, now I'll tell you, hear from me about how to practice Yoga Myunjan Madashre, how to be engaged in yoga under my shelter. And then he describes, basically, he describes many things in the 7th chapter, specifically the nature of Krishna, the nature of bhakti. And then in the 8th chapter, which is really a continuation of the explanation of the 7th chapter. This is an explanation of how to practice yoga under the shelter of Krishna. And so how do we do that? By constantly remembering him in whatever we do. By constantly remembering Krishna's instructions, constantly remembering Krishna's orders to Arjuna, Krishna's teachings, and the teachings of Krishna's devotees. By always remembering him and our relationship with him, by always remembering that we ourselves intrinsically have nothing to do with the material world. Nothing to do with it. But so by remembering that I have nothing to do with any of this, whatever activities I perform, whatever happens to me, happiness, suffering, all these things, vitaraga, bhaya, krodha, all these different things, happiness, anger, attachment, aversion, all these, has nothing to do with us. Because intrinsically we're servants of Krishna. So by remembering this, and by engaging in our activities with this in mind, then we develop a momentum throughout our life. We develop a momentum that this life is not for me. My life is not mine. My life is Krishna's. This is what surrender to Krishna means. Anukul yasya sankalpa. To accept that which is favorable to serving Krishna and reject everything unfavorable. And so by remembering Krishna, by remembering our relationship with him, automatically we'll give up that which is unfavorable and we'll accept that which is favorable. And in order to know what those things are, then we need to approach, Krishna says, Tadvidhi pranipadena pariprashnena sevya upadekshanti te jnanam jnaninas tattva darshinaha. He says, in order to know these things, you have to approach a guru. You have to approach a spiritual teacher who is a representative of Krishna, who can guide one to engage only in those activities which are favorable and to reject those things which are unfavorable. So Srila Prabhupada has given us this wonderful translation of Bhagavad Gita and commentary. He worked very hard. Actually, he finished, when he was in India in the 1940s, he finished the entire thing. He typed it, he had manuscripts ready, and he had a donor and everything. He was in Calcutta at the time, I think. Yeah, he was in Calcutta at the time. And he finished the entire thing. Right, yeah, because his family was living in Calcutta. So he was, and right when he was about to go print it, actually, he went to go get the manuscript from his home, and he found that somebody had stolen it. He suspected one of his sons. So then Srila Prabhupada eventually came to America in 1965 and worked very hard to translate, again, the entire thing. He had to do it all over again. And he worked very hard to translate it, to give wonderful commentary, very scholarly commentary, according to the previous acharyas, the previous teachers of Bhagavad Gita, previous commentators, and to also to present it in such a way, not just a scholarly presentation, but a very simultaneously scholarly but extremely practical presentation. A presentation which is easily digestible by anybody, really. So, to take advantage of the work of the previous acharyas is one way. Krishna says, Tadvidi pranipatena pariprashnena. He says, ask questions, inquire from. So the acharyas have spoken within their commentaries, and Srila Prabhupada presents many of their commentaries in here, and of course also his own. So a very good way of inquiring from the previous acharyas is by reading Srila Prabhupada's Bhagavad Gita and reading Srimad Bhagavatam and reading the works that the acharyas have written. And by this, many of one's questions can be answered just automatically. So it behooves us to study these things, because Bhagavad Gita teaches us how to live. Many people say that, okay, anyway, I'll get into it when I'm old, I'll read when I'm old. But what's the sense in learning how to live after you've lived your entire life already? Actually, Srimad Bhagavatam says, Kaumara acharet pragyo. When one is a child, actually, from childhood, one should try to assimilate this knowledge, because this is knowledge which should guide one throughout their life. So by very humbly and submissively and attentively studying the Bhagavad Gita, then one can learn properly how to live a successful life. A successful life means, like we heard, a life in which we can develop the momentum to remember Krishna and attain him at the time of death. And so there's so many details to that, but yeah. Hare Krishna.
Wonderful explanation, passionate explanation of Chapter-8. Thank you very much, Lila.
Hare Krishna.
Hope you continue for the rest of the chapters also.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Hare Krishna.
I'll put it on the WhatsApp group that those who could not come today must listen to this on YouTube.
Hare Krishna. Thank you, Prabhu.